In the late 890s, a young boy stood in front of Alfred the Great, that most mighty of warrior kings. Alfred treated this little visitor with the utmost affection, pulling him into a warm and loving hug. This young boy was the king's grandson, who was named Athelstan. Athelstan was said to be of astonishing beauty, and who possessed perfect manners. His politeness should be of no surprise. His father, Edward the Elder, another fine warrior king, had been reared at the court of his own father, Alfred, where he too had learned how to conduct himself in princely fashion, and given a thorough education in all the arts that would benefit him as a future king himself. Whilst Edward the Elder was not as obsessed as Alfred the Great had been when it came to education, it is still perfectly clear that Athelstan was being raised in such a way that he would one day be capable of walking in the same formidable footsteps as his father and grandfather. And, much to Athelstan's benefit, it wasn't just Edward and Alfred who shaped his childhood. It was decided, seemingly by Alfred, that Athelstan, at the age of about 4 or 5, would be educated at the court of Athelfled, Alfred's daughter and Athelstan's aunt. There were two reasons for this. Like her brother Edward the Elder, Athelfled had been the beneficiary of a thorough education, and her court would be the perfect place to raise a future king. Because of a difficult labour, Athelfled had chosen to only have one child, a daughter, a decision her husband, Athelred, ruler of Mercia, had accepted without question, and so both Athelred and Athelfled could quite happily raise another child. With Alfred suffering from ill health for most of his adult life, it's likely that, when this decision was made, the king sensed he didn't have much time left, which meant that Athelstan's father would soon be king. And aware that Edward was not as diligent as he had been when it came to education and raising children, Alfred perhaps feared that Athelstan's upbringing may be neglected somewhat should he remain too close by his father's side. So it was that Athelstan was raised at the court of Aunt Athelfled and Uncle Athelred. It proved a wise decision, as Athelstan, thanks to his aunt's tender care and the efforts of Athelred, that celebrated prince, he grew to be an almost perfect example of what a king should be. Before he died in 899, Alfred bestowed on little Athelstan a scarlet cloak, a glorious belt that was studded with diamonds, and a fine sword with a golden scabbard. This was, to all intents and purposes, the Anglo Saxon equivalent of a later knighting ceremony. What made it all the more remarkable was that Athelstan was, as I mentioned earlier, certainly no older than 5 when this took place. What Alfred was effectively saying was, here is a future king. While time was now short for Alfred the Great, and his long bout of illness, which was probably Crohn's disease, must have been afflicting him worse than ever at this stage, he could at least rest in his final hours knowing that he had left the future of Wessex in good hands. Edward the Elder was already well practiced in the art of war thanks to his and his father's campaigns against the Vikings. Athelfled, who Alfred clearly thought highly of and with good reason, proved herself to be an extraordinary asset to her brother Edward the Elder, especially after her husband died in 911. And little Athelstan, who was being raised among these most fine examples of royalty, would also prove himself to be the most worthy of successors to Alfred the Great. Edward the Elder died in 924, and Athelstan was crowned the following year. Whilst Alfred the Great had saved Wessex from falling into the clutches of the Vikings, and Edward the Elder and Athelfled had built upon that, conquering lands that had been taken by the Danes, and uniting Mercia and Wessex with Athelfled's death in 918, leaving Athelstan with a greatly expanded kingdom when he came to the throne. By the end of his own 15-year long reign, Aethelstan would be the undisputed power in Britain, obliterating his enemies, most famously at Brunanburh. The King of Scots, Constantine II, had been a frequent problem for Aethelstan, who led campaigns into Scotland, hoping to crush his enemy. But with Constantine now allying himself with the Vikings, he posed a very real threat to Aethelstan's kingdom when he invaded. However, the first king of the English was more than up to the task, as at Brunanburh his enemy was routed, and it was said that no greater slaughter had ever been seen than at Brunanburh. This victory remains one of the most consequential battles fought in English history. Had Athelstan lost, it could have changed the nation of England's history, still in its infancy, forever. But Athelstan was more than just a mighty warrior. Charitable and humble, he was beloved by the people he ruled over. Approachable and affable, Athelstan treated every man, regardless of rank, with respect, although, with his nobility, he was described as being reserved, perhaps to be on guard against ulterior motives. A deeply pious man, Athelstan treated his clergy with warmth, donating generously to religious houses, and to his ordinary subjects the king was kind. Physically, Athelstan was thin and of becoming stature, with his hair flaxen and beautifully wreathed with golden threads. William of Malmesbury attests to this, asserting that he saw Athelstan's remains, which were interred at Malmesbury a couple of centuries after the king's death in 939. Athelstan was certainly not without his imperfections. There was the controversial death of a half brother named Edwin, that is a small mark against his name. But, in truth, that is only a very slight criticism. Athelstan had been reared to be king in a challenging time, with the Vikings posing a terrible and persistent threat to the Anglo Saxons. However, it was of no doubt that Athelstan had inherited the fortitude of his father, grandfather, and aunt. In times of trouble, Athelstan would not fail either his duty or his people. From that day, during his childhood with his grandfather, Alfred, who had knighted him, Athelstan had been set on the road to kingship and, as time would tell, to everlasting glory, as he became not only the most respected man in the British Isles, but also in Europe.